Hey guys, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that we're supposed to reduce how much salt is in our diet. And you've probably heard this before, that too much salt can be responsible for a whole slew of chronic diseases, and we need to cut it out. But here's what I'm curious about. Is there any way we could sort of redesign salt so that we still get this great saltiness in our mouth when we're eating, but at the same time it reduces how much salt we consume? And I know this might sound like an impossible feat, but I've actually found 3 ways that research is currently trying to engineer the salt of the future. Before we jump in, I just want to point out the research paper where these different strategies are outlined. It's an excellent review paper, and it's called Food and Salt Structure Design for Salt Reducing, and I'll put a link below in the description. Alright, the first way we can play with salt is by changing the particle size, so changing how big or small salt is. Now, we already know that the smaller the salt particle, the more saltiness we perceive when we eat it. And I know this might seem a little counterintuitive, but you have to think of this from the perspective of the surface area and how the surface area is changing with particle size. And maybe you remember from whatever last math class you took that as a particle gets smaller and smaller, its ratio of surface area to volume gets larger and larger. So small particles tend to have a large surface area. And this is really key for us perceiving saltiness. And that's because for something to taste salty to us, for a food to taste salty, 2 steps have to occur. So as we're taking a bite, the salt crystals have to come in contact with our saliva and be dissolved. So this is where that surface area is really key. You want more surface area, so more saliva is in contact with the salt and more quickly dissolve that salt. Then the dissolved salt has to be transported to one of our taste buds, because this is what sends the signal to our brain saying, hey, we're tasting saltiness here. But if those 2 steps don't occur, if the salt is not dissolved and does not come in contact with the taste bud, we can eat salt, but it would not taste salty to us. And this is more likely to happen with big particles because they're too large to be fully dissolved if they were dissolved by our saliva at all. So if we want to maximize saltiness while lowering the amount of salt actually consumed, what this means is we should always use tiny particles. And again, that's because these have a high amount of surface area where the saliva, our saliva will quickly dissolve those tiny salt crystals, and this is what can trigger our taste buds to make the food taste salty. All right, let's move on to factor number 2 that we could tweak about salt, and this is changing its shape. And this actually is already happening because of where we source out our salt. So depending if you get salt from underground rock deposits versus seawater or sea salt, these actually already have very different shapes. So let's compare these. So salt from that underground rock deposit, these crystals tend to be like really densely packed together, and they're usually cube in shape. They have this very regular cubic shape, and it has a smooth surface. Now, salt from seawater, this has a totally different shape. So these tend to be crystals that are quite irregularly shaped, and they are more of an aggregate. So tinier crystals all come together to form this larger aggregate, which means there's a lot of pores, or it has quite a porous structure. Now, these 2 types of shapes, they will interact with our taste buds very differently. So sea salt is really good at triggering that saltiness taste in our mouths for a couple of reasons due to its shape. One, it tends to have these very irregularly shaped crystals, which would increase the contact area with our saliva. It kind of has a rougher, jagged surfaces. Additionally, when we use sea salt, usually it's an aggregate. So it's these tiny crystals, a lot of tiny crystals come together and form this larger aggregate or this larger crystal, which means the structure tends to be quite porous. And within these pores, our saliva can sort of sneak in and dissolve more salt, and that can trigger more of our taste buds. So really, it's another way to increase the contact area with our saliva. And another note about that aggregate structure, so it's built up of many tiny pieces. As we're eating, those aggregates tend to usually break into the smaller pieces again. They tend to fragment. And with each fragmentation, that also increases the contact area with our saliva. So there already seems to be a lot of different ways we could play with the shape that we know of to increase how much saltiness we perceive, but really minimize how much salt we eat. The third and final idea is to play with the structure of the salt crystals, or I guess actually get rid of part of the structure. So this idea is to make hollow salt particles. And we've actually seen a couple of successful products that have done this. There's been hollow spheres and hollow pyramids. And this hollow structure is dual purpose. The first is that, again, if the surface is still salt, that's what comes in contact with the saliva, is dissolved and triggers our taste buds. The second reason is that it gets rid of that salt in the center of the crystals that is not likely to be tasted anyways, but we would still eat it as part of the food. So it's an easy way to cut out that extra salt that really we're not tasting, but it's still entering into our body. All right, I hope you enjoyed this dive into some current food research. And if you liked this video and want others like it, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.